Since 1871, Asbury Park, New Jersey has occupied a single square mile of Atlantic coastline, boxed in by Deal Lake to the north and Wesley Lake to the south. Across Wesley Lake sits Ocean Grove, a Methodist camp meeting colony so strict it still chains its gates shut on Sundays. Asbury Park was built as its mirror and its escape at once. A boardwalk, an orchestra pavilion, and a pier reaching into the Atlantic, laid out by a Methodist convert who wanted the discipline of Ocean Grove without the gates. A line of railroad tracks ran straight through the middle of that single square mile. On one side of the tracks, people came to spend money. On the other side, people came to earn it. On neither side did anyone plan for what a single week of one summer would do to both. For nearly a century, the two halves of the town shared a name and almost nothing else. This is the story of the ground between two lakes, the tracks that quietly split it in half, and the week that made the split impossible to ignore. Chapter 1. The Bishop's Square Mile. James A. Bradley was a New York brush manufacturer, a man who had made what money he had in the unglamorous trade of combs and hairbrushes rather than steel or rail, and who had recently undergone a Methodist conversion that redirected the rest of his ambitions toward matters of moral order. In 1871, he paid $90,000 for roughly 500 acres of oceanfront scrub pinned between two small bodies of water, Deal Lake to the north, Wesley Lake to the south, land that held, at the moment of purchase, nothing but sand, scrub pine, and enough standing water to breed mosquitoes in numbers nobody had bothered to count. $90,000 was a considerable outlay for ground with no port, no rail line built to it yet, and no history of drawing anyone at all. The kind of purchase a cautious man does not make twice. He named the town after Francis Asbury, the first Methodist bishop in America, a man Bradley had never met and who had never set foot on the land now carrying his name. It was not a subtle choice, and it was not meant to be. The choice announced, before a single building went up, exactly what this town was meant to be. Next door, across Wesley Lake, sat the model Bradley had been studying before he ever bought an acre. Ocean Grove was a Methodist camp meeting colony, and its discipline was severe enough that it still chains its gates shut on Sundays. Bradley admired the discipline. He did not want the gate. His town would be devout, but it would also be open for commerce every day of the week. And that distinction, moral order without a fence around it, was the whole of his business plan. What Bradley built between 1871 and 1900, he built directly onto raw scrub ground. A boardwalk went down first, then an orchestra pavilion for the band concerts he insisted on hosting, then a pier that reached out into the Atlantic itself. Public changing rooms followed so visitors could arrive in street clothes and leave in bathing costumes without embarrassment. Trolley lines connected the resort to the rail junction and to Ocean Grove next door. Electric lighting reached the boardwalk. Artesian wells were drilled to supply water untouched by the swamp the town had been built over. In trolley service, electric lighting, and clean water alone, Asbury Park ran ahead of most American cities of comparable size, a resort outfitting itself with the infrastructure of a small metropolis before it had accumulated the population to justify any of it. For ground that had been sand and mosquito pools 3 years earlier, it was, by 1900, dense with the machinery of a functioning town. Bradley policed the morality of his creation as personally as he had built its infrastructure. No saloons operated within the town limits. No gambling dens opened their doors on the boardwalk he had built. No liquor was sold over any counter in Asbury Park, not by ordinance alone, but by the founder's own patrols and his own refusal to lease land to anyone who intended otherwise. He owned the ground the town stood on, and for 3 decades he behaved as if that ownership extended to the souls walking across it. It was total control, of a kind few American town founders ever attempted, and fewer still managed to hold. The same rail line and trolley tracks that carried Methodist families in from Newark and New York also ran past Ocean Avenue, and it would not be long before they began carrying passengers with a different purpose in mind. Men who looked at Bradley's crowds not as souls to discipline, but as customers to entertain. Chapter 2. Two Cities by Design. Bradley had built Asbury Park to discipline souls. Other men looked at the same crowds and saw customers. By the 1880s, George C. Tillieu arrived from Coney Island, already known along the New York shoreline for mechanical amusement, and set up steeplechase rides on Ocean Avenue. Horses that raced on iron rails, built to sell the sensation of speed to anyone who could afford a nickel. Bradley had banned the saloons. He had banned the gambling halls. He had never banned a carousel, and Tillieu built to the exact edge of what the ordinances allowed. He was still short of a decade from opening his own steeplechase park at Coney Island. Asbury Park's boardwalk was where he tested the formula first. The orchestra pavilion Bradley had raised for respectable Sunday listening now stood a few hundred feet from a ride built for nothing but thrill, and both drew paying lines. In 1888, Palace Amusements opened at the corner of Lake Avenue and Kingsley Street, a long brick and glass building built around a hand-carved carousel. Its horses turned and gilded by craftsmen paid to make painted wood look alive under gaslight. It was the largest single investment in pure amusement the town had yet seen, built on ground Bradley had sold off, precisely because he could not build it himself. The building would outlast the hotels, the piers, and the men who financed them. Long after most of what stood around it in 1888 was gone, its carved horses would still be turning under the same brick roof. Bradley's version of moral order had a second layer, one measured by race rather than by vice. His beachfront rules kept black residents and workers, the cooks preparing meals in hotel kitchens, the staff changing linens each morning, off the beach and off the boardwalk during the hours when visitors filled them. These were the same hours those workers had just finished serving. Bradley enforced this the way he enforced the ban on liquor, through ownership of the land rather than any elected authority. The ordinance did not apply to where they slept, only to where they were permitted to stand once the shift ended. West of the rail line that split Bradley's 500 acres in two, a second town was taking shape under the same municipal boundary and almost none of the same investment. Black families who cooked in the hotel kitchens and changed the linens each morning went home, each evening, to the streets they were building for themselves, and by the turn of the century they had a main street of their own on Springwood Avenue. Springwood Avenue grew its own storefronts, groceries, barbershops, clubs, churches. A main street built the same way Bradley's had been, one owner at a time. One main street answered to Bradley's ordinances, the other did not answer to them at all. Bradley had platted Asbury Park as a single resort. From its first decade, it operated as two towns sharing one name, one built for visitors, one built by the people who served them. By the turn of the century, both towns still felt improvised. Bradley's boardwalk still mostly wood and canvas awnings, Springwood Avenue still finding its footing block by block. Neither would stay that way. In the first years of the new century, a different scale of money started looking at Asbury Park's ocean front. Money interested in permanence, steel frames, elevators, hotels built to outlast the men who financed them. That money had not arrived yet. It was already on its way. Chapter 3. The Queen at Full Tide. The money that had been on its way arrived in earnest in the first years of the new century, and it built upward rather than out. The plaza rose first along the ocean front, then the Monterey, each hotel taller and more permanent than anything Bradley had needed when he was still policing saloons by ordinance alone. In 1925 came the Berkeley Carteret, 7 stories of brick with elevators and a roofline view of the Atlantic. A building that did the work of respectability on its own, one guest ledger at a time, long after Bradley himself had stopped walking the boardwalk to enforce it. By 1912, Yazlakana Lahio Boldi Kemiuldi, the New York Times was reporting a summer population that could reach 200,000, 20 times the town's year-round count. A resort that emptied out every winter and refilled every June on a schedule nobody had to post. At its peak, the boardwalk pulled 600,000 visitors through that stretch of shoreline in a single year, arriving by rail from New York, from Newark, from Philadelphia. The nickname came after the numbers, not before them. Queen of the Jersey Shore, a crown nobody incorporated and everybody used, earned the way a resort earns anything, by outdrawing its neighbors, summer after summer. By 1928, the city was building for permanence rather than paint. It hired Warren and Wetmore, the same firm that had designed Grand Central Terminal in New York, to raise Convention Hall directly on the boardwalk, and beside it the Paramount Theater, a 1,600-seat house with its own vaulted hall of brick and steel extending out over the ocean itself. The work ran through 1930. At the boardwalk's southern end, the casino arena and the carousel house closed out the skyline, so that a visitor walking the full length of the boardwalk passed 4 major structures without once stepping off the planks. Grand Central's architects hired to build a beach pavilion. That alone measured how seriously the resort had come to take itself. Through the 1930s, Convention Hall filled summer after summer with the era's biggest touring orchestras, the kind of names that could sell out a Manhattan ballroom, booked instead into a hall built over Atlantic salt water. Money came by rail, unloaded at the station every few hours, and by trolley, run down Ocean Avenue on a schedule tuned to the trains. More of it came straight off the boardwalk's own machinery. The saltwater baths, the penny arcades, the restaurants strung the length of the planks, a system built to pull a nickel or a dollar out of every appetite a vacationing crowd could produce. The boardwalk was not a place people visited. It was a machine that converted summer into cash, running at full capacity every season the trains kept arriving. Picture the boardwalk on a Saturday evening in August of 1933. The Paramount Theater marquee runs bright the length of the block, the planks beneath it still warm from the day's sun. Convention Hall's doors stand open, a touring orchestra's brass carrying 50 feet into the salt air. Trolleys run packed down Ocean Avenue every few minutes, feeding a crowd off the last trains out of Penn Station. At the boardwalk's southern end, the casino carousel turns under its own string of bulbs, calliope competing with the horns from the hall. Fried food, cigarette smoke, the tide moving underneath all of it. A resort that had been sand and standing water 62 years earlier now looked, on a night like this, permanent. 4 blocks inland, past the rail line, none of that light reached Springwood Avenue at all. The summer of 1934 opened the same way every summer had opened since Bradley first drilled a well into the sand. Trains on schedule, hotels booked through Labor Day, an orchestra already lined up on Convention Hall's calendar. On the morning of September 8th, the ocean off the boardwalk lay flat and calm, and nothing on the horizon looked unusual at all. Chapter 4. The Ship That Came Ashore. The calm that lay over the water that morning was already a lie by the time anyone on the boardwalk noticed it. Off the New Jersey coast in the dark, fire had broken out aboard the ocean liner SS Morro Castle at 2:50 in the morning, well past the horizon of anything Asbury Park could see from its own beach. The ship's captain had died suddenly in his cabin the night before, and the crew who inherited the emergency were, in large part, untrained for it. The lifeboats were not accessible in the numbers the ship needed, and few of the men lowering them had ever done it under fire. Men and women went over the rail into the Atlantic anyway, because the boats were not coming for them, and the fire was. By the time anyone could count what the night had cost, 137 people were dead. The ship did not sink. Abandoned, still burning, it drifted the length of the New Jersey coastline through the whole of that day. No captain, no working crew, no destination. Trailing smoke that was visible from the boardwalk long before the hull was. People gathered along the rail through the afternoon, and watched the smudge on the horizon thicken and grow, hour by hour, the way a storm is watched rather than a wreck, until it resolved into a blackened superstructure and a name still legible on the bow. At 7:34 in the evening, it grounded 200 feet from Convention Hall, close enough that families who had admired flat water that morning spent the evening watching a hull smolder against the same skyline. Visitors had always paid to look at things in Asbury Park, to hear the orchestras fill Convention Hall, to ride Tillyou's steeplechase horses, to turn the hand-carved horses at Palace Amusements. Now, while bodies were still washing onto the sand below Convention Hall, the city opened the solarium to paying visitors. The glass had been built for watching the tide come in. It now looked out on scorched plating and a hull still ticking as it cooled. Admission was charged for the view. The hulk stayed where it grounded for about 6 months. Paint blistered. The steel went a deeper black with every week of salt and weather. Salvage crews stripped what metal they could reach while ticket holders watched from the solarium above them, and still the ship sat, canted against the pilings, visible from blocks in either direction, through that whole autumn and into the following spring, before it was finally towed off the sand for scrap. It remains, without much exaggeration, one of the strangest tourist attractions in American history. A wreck that never left the beach long enough to stop being an exhibit. The Second World War did what the Morro Castle could not. It emptied the hotels on the city's own terms. The Army and the Navy requisitioned the grand oceanfront buildings, and the Berkeley Carteret among them, for training and for convalescence. Soldiers drilled on ground where orchestras had played. Wounded men recovered in rooms built for honeymooners and band leaders. For the length of the war, the boardwalk that had run on paying customers for 70 years ran on orders instead. After 1945, the crowds came back. Hotels reopened. Trolleys ran. On a Saturday night in July, Asbury Park looked, from the boardwalk, exactly like it had in 1933. But the families walking that boardwalk were arriving by a different means than they had before the war. And in the years just ahead, the arithmetic behind an Asbury Park vacation was already beginning to change, in ways nothing on the surface yet showed. Chapter 5. The Road Past the Gates. What was waiting in the years just ahead was the automobile, and the road built to carry it. Between 1947 and 1955, New Jersey opened the Garden State Parkway in stretches down the length of the shore, and for a few seasons nobody in Asbury Park thought much of it. The same road, after all, still ran within a few miles of the boardwalk, and then quietly it started carrying people somewhere else. The Parkway let a family from Newark or Trenton reach beaches 30 and 40 miles farther south in the same driving time it once took to reach Asbury Park by rail, and those beaches were newer, quieter, and rimmed with parking lots instead of trolley stops. The 2-week hotel booking, renewed every August since before the war, gave way to an afternoon on the sand and a drive home before dark. The families still came. They no longer stayed, and they no longer spent like people who intended to. Suburban malls, built inland along the new roads through the 1950s, took the trade that had filled Asbury Park's downtown department stores for 2 generations, and roadside motels, built at the Parkway's own exits with parking lots at the door, took the overnight trade that had filled the resort's hotel registers every summer since Bradley's day. The Parkway itself carried off the day trippers who used to arrive by rail and stay the week, sending them farther south by evening instead. The Berkeley Carteret, 7 stories of brick that had done the work of respectability since 1925, began sliding into deferred maintenance. Nobody had scheduled to reverse. Paint peeled off its window frames a season at a time. Upper floors went unbooked long enough that the hotel simply stopped opening them, room by room, floor by floor. Somewhere in 1955 or 1956, a sign painter working the Palace Amusements building on Lake Avenue gave its brick facade a new face. a wide, gap-toothed grin borrowed loosely from the old steeplechase logo George Tillieu had brought to Ocean Avenue 70 years earlier. Inside, the same hand-carved carousel that had opened in 1888 was still turning under the same brick roof. Now it turned beneath a grin 40 feet wide, visible from blocks down the boardwalk in either direction. A smile painted onto the one building in Asbury Park that would outlast nearly everything standing around it, fixed in place at almost the exact moment those other buildings stopped being repaired. West of the tracks, the arrangement had never offered more than one line of work. The resort economy was seasonal by design, hiring heaviest in June and thinnest by October, and menial by custom. Kitchens, laundries, bellhop stands, the boardwalk's own maintenance crews. Redlining kept mortgage money out of Springwood Avenue block by block. Segregated hiring kept the resort's better jobs. The hotel front desks, the boardwalk ticket booths, the convention hall box office, closed to the same families who cooked the food and made the beds inside those buildings. By the late 1960s, unemployment among young black men on the West Side ran far above the New Jersey average. The city's recreation programs for West Side teenagers were cut through these same years, one line item at a time, while 4 blocks away the boardwalk kept its lights burning through every night of the season. In 1968, above a shoe store at 700 Cookman Avenue, Tom and Margaret Potter opened a room with no liquor license and no fixed closing hour. Teenage musicians filled it most nights, trading instruments and stage time until dawn, in a building that had never been built for music at all. Around them, the hotels that had filled every August for 80 years were beginning, block by block, to sit empty through the very weeks that used to be the busiest of the year. The room above the shoe store stayed lit past 4 in the morning, on a street where, increasingly, it was the only light left on. Chapter 6. The Week of Fire. The Upstage Club kept running past 4 in the morning through 1968 through 1969 and into the summer of 1970. The one room on Cookman Avenue that stayed lit on a schedule the rest of the resort had stopped keeping. It had no liquor license and no formal stage, only a raised platform above a shoe store and a rotating cast of teenage musicians who came up and down the Jersey Shore circuit to sit in, trade instruments, and wait their turn until the room emptied at dawn. The crowd inside ran mixed, black and white together, in a town that had kept its own boardwalk segregated by custom and by hour for the better part of a century. Among the regulars, most nights that summer, was a guitar player from Freehold, a few miles inland, thin enough to lose in a crowded room, who stayed later than almost anyone and left with the sun. Nothing about him marked him that July as anything but one more player on a full stage. 4 blocks west, on Springwood Avenue, nobody was staying up past 4 in the morning by choice. That was the summer of 1970. On the evening of July 4th, Independence Day, what had been accumulating on the West Side for years reached Springwood Avenue directly. The seasonal work that never became year-round work, the redlining that kept mortgage money off the street, the recreation budget that had been cut for West Side teenagers while the boardwalk's lights ran uninterrupted 4 blocks away. None of it arrived that night as an argument. It arrived as a window breaking on Springwood Avenue itself. Then another. By nightfall, the broken windows had become fires, and the fires had become something the West Side and the Asbury Park Police Department could no longer describe to each other as an isolated incident. The second night brought more of the same. So did the third. By the time it was over, a single evening of broken glass had become a week of open conflict between West Side residents and police, running block by block down the same street that had carried the neighborhood's business for half a century. By July 8th, 46 people had been admitted to area hospitals with gunshot wounds. Before the week was finished, the injured numbered more than 180. 15 of them New Jersey state troopers. Police made 167 arrests, National Guard units staged on the edges of the city, ready and not yet called in, while state troopers sealed off the West Side block by block. until a neighborhood that had always technically belonged to Asbury Park spent most of a week cut off from it entirely. The two cities Bradley had platted a century earlier were, for the length of that week, patrolled as two separate jurisdictions. The property damage came to around $4 million. Cleanup added another $1.6 million on top of that. Roughly 75% of the businesses on Springwood Avenue were damaged or looted outright, concentrated on the one street that had carried the entire commercial weight of the West Side since the turn of the century. The groceries that had fed West Side families for 2 generations, the barber shops that had cut 2 generations of hair on that same block, the clubs that had kept Springwood Avenue lit after dark since before most of the boardwalk's grand hotels were built. All of it, gone inside of 7 days. The fires were out by the following week. 4 blocks east, past the tracks that had split the town since 1871, the boardwalk lights came on again that Saturday night, the same as they always had. Convention hall's doors open, the tide coming in flat and calm. Tourists who had not set foot on Springwood Avenue in years and had no reason to start now. What Asbury Park actually lost that week did not appear in any fire report, and it did not appear in that Saturday night's boardwalk crowd either. It would not be visible from the boardwalk for a long time. Chapter 7. Greetings from the Ruins. What Asbury Park lost that week showed up first as paperwork. Insurance adjusters walked Springwood Avenue in the weeks after the fires and reached the same conclusion, address by address. Too much risk, too little value left to justify a policy. Insurers refused to rebuild. Owners who had run the same groceries and barbershops for 2 generations took the loss on paper and did not come back to argue it. Block by block, storefront by storefront, lot by lot, Springwood Avenue went from a commercial street to an inventory of rubble and weeds. 4 blocks east, the same mechanism worked just as quietly and just as completely. White vacationers who had booked the Berkeley Carteret every August since before the war watched the fires on television that week, and by the following June they had crossed Asbury Park off a list they never announced they were keeping. The resort's one industry, other people's leisure, does not recover from a headline. It evaporates from one, almost overnight. The rest of the decade arrived as a slow accounting of what was left. Hotels that had turned away walk-ins every August for 80 years began closing floor by floor, top down, the way a building empties when nobody is left to fill the upper rooms. No orchestra booked the summer after next. No trolley ran packed down Ocean Avenue. No line ever reformed at the casino carousel. The Upstage shut its door above the shoe store in 1971. The one room on Cookman Avenue that had stayed lit past 4 in the morning for 3 straight summers. Arcades along the boardwalk boarded their windows one by one. Penny machines silent behind plywood, nobody bothered to paint. Restaurants that had run full through every August since the 20s closed the kitchen for good instead of reopening in June. A city that had once entertained 600,000 people in a single summer could not fill a Tuesday matinee. And then, on January 5, 1973, Columbia Records released the debut album of the guitar player who used to stay until dawn above the shoe store on Cookman Avenue. Its title was Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey. Its cover was a boardwalk postcard, the same cheerful image the resort had been printing and selling to strangers for half a century. The postcard promised a place that by January of 1973 existed mostly in insurance reports and boarded arcade windows. 13 months later, on February 8, 1974, a failed restaurant on Ocean Avenue reopened as the Stone Pony, run by an owner named Jack Roig, who had bet a going concern on a street the town's own hotels had already given up on. That September, the same guitar player from the Upstage walked in and joined the house band on stage. He was not yet famous enough that the room stopped what it was doing. He was famous enough within a few years that the room became the reason people still knew the name Asbury Park at all. As the town kept emptying through the decade, its name kept traveling in the other direction. Sung from stages and cities, that had never sent a single tourist to the boardwalk, an elegy standing in for the advertising nobody in Asbury Park had bought. Not every fixture on the boardwalk went dark. Madame Marie had been reading palms from a booth she called the Temple of Knowledge since 1932, a stall barely large enough to seat 2 people, and she kept reading them through the empty seasons the way she had through the crowded ones. In 1973, the same year that put a postcard on an album cover, a Springsteen lyric put her in a song too. A fortune teller made permanent almost the exact moment the boardwalk around her booth stopped paying anyone else's rent. Madame Marie's booth needed no insurance claim and no relief fund. It only needed someone willing to sit in it every day the boardwalk stayed open. In the mid-1980s, 2 brothers looked at the boarded arcades, the rusted hotel floors, and the blocks the insurers had refused, and decided none of it was actually beyond repair. Chapter 8. The Smile That Remained. Henry and Sebastian Vaccaro were developers, and in the mid-1980s their plan for Asbury Park was arithmetic, not nostalgia. They restored the Berkeley Carteret first, reopening the 7-story hotel that had been going floor by floor since the Parkway diverted the day trippers, and then signed the deal meant to fund everything else, a contract with Carabetta Enterprises for 2,400 waterfront condominiums, the largest single bet the oceanfront had seen since Warren and Wetmore raised Convention Hall. Sales brochures promised glass balconies and private beach access facing the Atlantic. Not one of the 2,400 units was ever sold. The partnership collapsed into bankruptcy in 1989, and construction stopped where it stood. An 11-story steel skeleton rising directly off the beach, rebar exposed to salt air, no glass, no walls, no roof. For more than a decade, it was the only postcard image the town had left of itself. Unfinished, rusting, facing the ocean. Everything around it kept sinking through the 1990s. The casino arena, empty since the fires, was gutted to its structural frame. The palace closed its doors for good in 1988. The carousel silent under Tilly's grin for the first time in 100 years. Storefront churches and pawn shops filled the lots till filled the ground floors along Cookman Avenue, where department stores had run through the Queen's whole reign. By the mid-1990s, the Berkeley Carteret itself sat half vacant again, the Vaccaro's restoration abandoned, along with everything else they had promised. Population sank towards 16,000. Poverty in Asbury Park ran near 3 times the New Jersey average. The hotel lobby, the unfinished tower, and Cookman Avenue, all 3 were losing money on the same 4 blocks in the same 10 years. The turnaround, when it arrived around 2000, came from a direction nobody on Ocean Avenue had budgeted for. Gay New Yorkers, priced out of the city, began buying the derelict Victorian houses on the streets behind the boardwalk, one house at a time, restoring porches and gingerbread trim that had been rotting since the Nixon administration. No redevelopment plan drove it. Hundreds of individual buyers did, house by house. In 2000, Dominic Santana bought the shuttered Stone Pony and reopened it under his own name. Galleries followed onto Cookman Avenue. Restaurants followed the galleries. In 2004, a structural inspection condemned the Palace Amusements building, and crews took down the brick roof under which the carved carousel horses had turned since 1888. Before the walls came down, a campaign calling itself Save Tilly cut the painted grin free of the brick behind it in one piece, and the wall came down without it. In 2016, the Asbury Hotel opened inside a derelict Salvation Army building, the town's first new hotel in half a century. The boardwalk filled back in behind it. Surf shops, summer festivals, sold-out nights at the Stone Pony Summer Stage. None of it reached Springwood Avenue. More than 50 years after the fires, the street still carries vacant lots and fresh promises in roughly equal measure. The redevelopment money that reached Cookman Avenue never crossed the tracks in the same proportion. Median income on the west side runs at a fraction of the beachfront blocks, 400 yards away. The two towns James Bradley platted in 1871 never merged. Not through the boom, not through the fire, not through the comeback that followed either one. Convention Hall still stands directly over the Atlantic, the same vaulted brick and steel worn and Wetmore raised in 1930. The brick has gone the color of driftwood under 9 decades of salt, and before every show now crews hang netting from the ceiling to catch what the building sheds onto the seats below. Bands still play there most summer weekends, the ocean audible through the wall behind the stage, an audience sitting under a net. Nobody in 1930 built the hall to need. A few blocks north, behind a pane of protective glass, the Grin Save Tilly cut free in 2004 is still 40 feet wide. The paint retouched. The gap between the front teeth exactly where a sign painter left it decades earlier. The roof it once turned beneath is gone. The carousel is gone with it. The paint is still bright under the glass,